Never assume you know who the real heroes of World War II were, because in July 1944, a decorated German officer walked into Adolf Hitler's headquarters with a briefcase bomb, ready to blow the dictator to pieces and end the war from the inside. His name was Claus von Stauffenberg, and he came within inches of changing history forever. This isn't some Hollywood fiction. This is the true story of a man who wore the Nazi uniform but became Hitler's most dangerous enemy. A soldier who lost an eye, his right hand, and 2 fingers on his left hand in combat, yet still found the strength to challenge the most evil regime in human history. And when British soldiers first heard about what happened that day in East Prussia, they couldn't believe it. A German officer had actually tried to kill Hitler and stop the war himself. But here's what makes this story even more unbelievable. Stauffenberg wasn't alone. There was an entire network of German military officers, politicians, and civilians who spent years planning to overthrow Hitler from within. They risked everything, knowing that if they failed, their deaths would be slow and brutal. And fail they did. But the story of how they almost succeeded reveals a side of Nazi Germany that most people never learn about. So, how does a loyal German officer go from serving the Third Reich to becoming the man who plants a bomb under Hitler's table? What pushed him over the edge? And why did his plan, which came so close to working, ultimately fall apart in the most tragic way possible? Let's go back to the beginning, the making of a German officer, Klaus Philipp Maria Justinian Schenk. Graf von Stauffenberg was born in 1907 into an old aristocratic family in southern Germany. His full name alone tells you everything about his background. This wasn't some random soldier. This was nobility, the kind of family that had served Germany for generations. Growing up, Stauffenberg was smart, athletic, and deeply religious. He loved poetry and music. He wasn't the typical image of a Nazi thug. In fact, when Hitler first came to power in 1933, Stauffenberg had mixed feelings. Like many Germans, he appreciated that Hitler was bringing order and national pride back to a country that had been humiliated after World War I. But he also saw the violence, the racism, and the attacks on the church. He didn't like it. Still, Stauffenberg was a soldier first. He joined the military because he believed in serving his country, not because he worshipped Hitler. And in the early years, he convinced himself that the bad parts of the Nazi regime would fade away once Germany was strong again. A lot of Germans told themselves the same lie. By 1939, when World War II started, Stauffenberg was already a respected officer. He fought in Poland, then in France. He was good at his job, strategic, calm under pressure, respected by his men. He believed he was fighting for Germany, not for Hitler's twisted vision. But then came the invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, and that's when everything changed. Witnessing the horror Operation Barbarossa, the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union, was supposed to be a quick victory. Hitler thought his armies would crush the Soviets in a matter of months. Instead, it became a nightmare that would eventually destroy the Third Reich. Stauffenberg served on the Eastern Front, and what he saw there shook him to his core. This wasn't war as he understood it. This was mass murder. The SS and special killing squads followed behind the regular army, rounding up Jews, communists, and anyone else the Nazis considered undesirable. They shot them in ditches. They burned villages. They starved prisoners of war to death. Stauffenberg watched German soldiers participate in atrocities. He heard the reports. He saw the evidence. And he realized that this wasn't about defending Germany anymore. This was about something far darker. One moment in particular haunted him. In 1942, he witnessed the aftermath of a massacre of Jewish civilians. Bodies everywhere, women, children, old men, all dead. And he knew that this was happening all across the occupied territories. Thousands of these killings, maybe millions of victims. For Stauffenberg, this was the breaking point. He was a Catholic who took his faith seriously. He believed in honor, in duty, in the difference between right and wrong. And what he was seeing wasn't just wrong, it was evil, pure evil. He started talking quietly with other officers who felt the same way, men who had served Germany with pride, but who now realized they were serving a monster. They began to ask dangerous questions. What if the only way to save Germany was to get rid of Hitler? What if the war couldn't be won, and continuing to fight would only lead to Germany's total destruction? What if they had a duty to stop this madness, even if it meant treason? These weren't easy questions. These men had sworn oaths to Hitler. They had families who could be punished if they were caught. They knew that even talking about resistance could get them killed, but they kept talking anyway. And slowly, a conspiracy began to form. The bomb that changed everything. In April 1943, Stauffenberg was serving in North Africa when his vehicle hit a landmine during an Allied air attack. The explosion nearly killed him. He lost his left eye, his right hand, and 2 fingers on his left hand. He spent months in the hospital recovering. Most people would have seen this as the end of their military career. Stauffenberg saw it as a calling. While he was recovering, he had a lot of time to think, and he came to a conclusion that would define the rest of his short life. Germany was going to lose the war. That was now obvious. The Allies were too strong, and Hitler's leadership was driving Germany toward total destruction. The only question was how many more people would die before it was over, unless someone stopped Hitler first. Stauffenberg decided he would be that someone, not because he loved the Allies or wanted Germany to lose, but because he believed that removing Hitler was the only way to save what was left of his country. Maybe, just maybe, if Hitler was gone, Germany could negotiate a peace deal with the Western Allies before the Soviets completely overran them. Maybe they could avoid the total destruction that was coming. It was a long shot, but it was the only shot they had. When Stauffenberg returned to duty in 1943, he threw himself into the conspiracy. There was already a resistance network in place, led by older officers and civilians who had been plotting against Hitler for years. But they had never been able to get close enough to the dictator to do anything. Hitler was paranoid, surrounded by security, constantly changing his schedule. Stauffenberg brought something new to the conspiracy: access. Because of his war wounds and his reputation as a hero, he was promoted to a position that gave him regular meetings with Hitler. He would be in the same room as the Führer, close enough to kill him. Now they just needed a plan. Operation Valkyrie. The plan. Within a plan, the conspiracy wasn't just about killing Hitler. That was only step one. The real challenge was what came next. If Hitler died, but the Nazi leadership stayed in power, nothing would change. Himmler or Göring would just take over, and the war would continue. So the conspirators came up with something brilliant. They would use the Nazi regime's own emergency plans against itself. There was a real operation called Valkyrie that Hitler himself had authorized. It was designed to put down any internal uprising in Germany if foreign workers or prisoners ever rebelled. Under Valkyrie, the German Reserve Army would take control of all government buildings, communication centers, and key infrastructure to restore order. The conspirators realized they could hijack this plan. After Hitler was killed, they would activate Valkyrie and tell the Reserve Army that there had been a coup by rogue SS members. The army would then arrest the SS leadership, take control of Berlin, and install a new government made up of the conspirators themselves. This new government would immediately seek peace with the Allies. It was audacious, it was complicated, and it required perfect timing. Stauffenberg wasn't just the assassin, he was also one of the few officers with the authority to activate Valkyrie. So he had to do both jobs: kill Hitler, then race back to Berlin to lead the coup. Everything depended on him. The failed attempts. Stauffenberg didn't just try once to kill Hitler. He tried multiple times before the famous bomb plot, and each time something went wrong. The first attempt was in late 1943. Stauffenberg brought a bomb to a meeting with Hitler, but the Führer left early. No chance. The second attempt was in early 1944. Stauffenberg had the bomb ready, but Himmler and Göring weren't at the meeting. The conspirators wanted to kill all three leaders at once to make sure the coup would succeed. So they called it off. Each failed attempt was dangerous. Every time Stauffenberg walked into a meeting with a bomb in his briefcase, he risked being searched or discovered. Every delay gave the Gestapo more time to uncover the conspiracy. Several members of the resistance network had already been arrested for other reasons, and the conspirators knew it was only a matter of time before the secret police found out what they were planning. They were running out of time. The Allies had landed in France in June 1944. The Soviets were pushing hard from the east. Germany was collapsing. If they didn't act soon, there would be nothing left to save. Finally, in July 1944, Stauffenberg got the call. There would be a meeting at Hitler's headquarters in East Prussia on July 20th. Hitler would be there. This was it. This had to be the day. Stauffenberg made his decision. Even if Himmler and Göring weren't there, he would do it anyway. He would kill Hitler, and they would deal with the rest later. He packed his briefcase with British-made plastic explosives. 2 bombs, actually, each one powerful enough to destroy a room. Together, they would guarantee Hitler's death. And on the morning of July 20th, 1944, Stauffenberg flew to the Wolf's Lair, Hitler's heavily fortified command center in the forests of East Prussia. July 20th, 1944, the day everything changed. The Wolf's Lair was a fortress, concrete bunkers hidden among the trees, surrounded by minefields and guard posts. Hitler felt safe here, far from the Allied bombers that were pounding German cities. Stauffenberg arrived that morning with his aide, Lieutenant Werner von Heften. They carried the bombs in a briefcase. The plan was simple. During the meeting, Stauffenberg would excuse himself, activate the bombs, leave the briefcase in the room, and get out before they exploded. But almost immediately, things started going wrong. First, Stauffenberg learned that the meeting had been moved from Hitler's underground bunker to a wooden conference building above ground. This was bad news. In a concrete bunker, the blast would be contained and amplified, guaranteeing everyone inside would die. In a wooden building with windows, much of the blast would escape. The bombs might not be enough. Second, Stauffenberg was rushed. He needed a few minutes alone to activate both bombs, but he kept getting interrupted. He only had time to activate one of the two bombs before an officer knocked on the door and told him Hitler was ready to start the meeting. One bomb, an above-ground building. Already the plan was falling apart. But Stauffenberg had no choice. He was out of chances. It was now or never. He walked into the conference room carrying the briefcase. It was a hot day, and all the windows were open to let in air. About 20 officers were gathered around a large oak table, studying maps of the Eastern Front. Hitler stood at the center, leaning over the table, listening to a report about the Soviet advance. Stauffenberg placed the briefcase under the table as close to Hitler as he could get it. Then he muttered an excuse about needing to make a phone call and left the room. He walked quickly to a car that was waiting for him outside. His heart was pounding. He checked his watch. The bomb had a 10-minute fuse. And then he waited. The explosion that wasn't enough. At exactly 12:42 p.m., the bomb exploded. The blast tore through the conference room with a deafening roar. The wooden building shattered. Papers and debris flew everywhere. Bodies were thrown across the room. Smoke and dust filled the air. Stauffenberg, watching from a distance, saw the explosion and assumed everyone inside was dead. There was no way Hitler could have survived that. No way. He and Haeften immediately drove toward the airfield to fly back to Berlin and launch the coup. On the way, they had to bluff their way through several security checkpoints, but Stauffenberg was calm and convincing. He was a wounded war hero after all. Nobody suspected him. But back at the conference room, something impossible had happened. Hitler was alive. Here's what went wrong. After Stauffenberg left the room, another officer, Colonel Heinz Brandt, had moved the briefcase. It was in his way as he tried to get closer to the map table, so he pushed it to the other side of a thick oak table support. That support shielded Hitler from the worst of the blast. When the bomb exploded, 4 men died instantly. Several others were badly wounded. Hitler's pants were shredded, his hair was smoking, and his eardrums were damaged. But he was alive. And within minutes, the Gestapo knew exactly what had happened. Someone had tried to assassinate the Führer, and they were going to find out who. The coup that almost worked. Stauffenberg didn't know Hitler had survived. As far as he knew, the dictator was dead and the coup was on. He landed in Berlin around 4 p.m. and immediately went to the Reserve Army headquarters. This was the command center for Operation Valkyrie. The other conspirators were waiting for him. But things were already unraveling. News from the Wolf's Lair was confusing. Some reports said Hitler was dead. Others said he was alive. The conspirators didn't know what to believe, and without clear information, many of them hesitated to act. Stauffenberg insisted Hitler was dead. He had seen the explosion himself. They needed to move now, before the SS could reorganize, and for a few hours, it actually worked. Valkyrie was activated. Army units in Berlin received orders to seize control of government buildings. They surrounded SS headquarters. They arrested senior Nazi officials. For a brief moment, it looked like the coup might actually succeed. In Paris, the German military commander arrested the entire SS and Gestapo leadership in France. He believed Hitler was dead and the new government was taking over. But back in Berlin, everything fell apart when Hitler himself got on the radio. The Führer's voice. At around 6:30 p.m., Hitler made a phone call to Berlin. His voice was unmistakable, even if it was hoarse and shaky. He was alive. The coup was a lie. That single phone call destroyed everything. Officers who had been following Valkyrie orders suddenly realized they had been tricked. The reserve army units stopped taking orders from the conspirators. Some of them turned their guns on Stauffenberg and the other plotters instead. At the reserve army headquarters, chaos erupted. Officers who were loyal to Hitler stormed the building. There was shouting, confusion, a few gunshots. Stauffenberg tried to rally support, but it was over. Nobody was going to follow a failed assassin. By midnight, it was finished. The coup had collapsed. The conspirators were surrounded. Stauffenberg, along with 3 other leaders of the plot, was arrested in his office. There was no trial, no chance to explain or defend themselves. A quick military court sentenced them to death on the spot. Just after midnight on July 21, 1944, less than 12 hours after the bomb went off, Claus von Stauffenberg was led into the courtyard and shot by firing squad. His last words were, "Long live sacred Germany." The brutal aftermath. Hitler's revenge was swift and terrible. He didn't just want the conspirators dead. He wanted them humiliated, tortured, and erased from history. He wanted to make an example that would terrify anyone else who even thought about resisting. Over the next few months, the Gestapo rounded up everyone connected to the plot. Not just the soldiers and officers, but their families, too. Wives, children, even distant relatives were arrested under the Nazi policy of Sippenhaft, which means clan liability. If you committed treason, your entire family would be punished. More than 7,000 people were arrested. Around 5,000 of them were executed. The trials were a grotesque mockery of justice. The conspirators were brought before the People's Court, where a screaming judge named Roland Freisler hurled insults at them while they stood in oversized clothes, forbidden from wearing belts or suspenders so their pants would fall down and make them look ridiculous. Many of the condemned were hanged with piano wire from meat hooks. Hitler ordered the executions to be filmed so he could watch them later. Among the dead was Erwin von Witzleben, a field marshal and one of the senior military leaders of the plot. Also executed was Ludwig Beck, a former chief of staff who had resigned in protest of Hitler's war plans back in 1938. These weren't cowards or criminals. They were men who had served Germany with honor for decades. Even Erwin Rommel, the famous Desert Fox and one of Germany's most celebrated generals, was implicated in the plot. He hadn't been directly involved, but he had known about it and hadn't reported it. Hitler gave him a choice: face a public trial and watch his family suffer, or commit suicide and be buried with full military honors. Rommel took poison in October 1944. Hitler's paranoia reached new heights after the bomb plot. He trusted no one. The Wehrmacht, the regular German army, was now under constant surveillance by the SS. Officers had to give the Nazi salute instead of the traditional military salute. Any hint of disloyalty meant death. Why the British couldn't believe it. When news of the assassination attempt reached the Allies, the British and American intelligence services were stunned. Up until that point, most Allied leaders believed that all Germans supported Hitler. Sure, there were some anti-Nazi exiles and refugees, but inside Germany, they assumed everyone was either a true believer or too scared to resist. The idea that German officers, some of them high-ranking generals, had tried to kill Hitler and overthrow the regime from within was almost unthinkable. British soldiers who heard about the plot had mixed reactions. Some admired Stauffenberg's courage, others were skeptical. Why should they care if Nazis were killing each other? Germany had started the war. They had bombed London, massacred civilians, built death camps. One dead Nazi officer wasn't going to change that. But for those who looked closer, the July 20th plot revealed something important. Not all Germans were Nazis. There were people inside Germany who hated Hitler as much as the Allies did. People who were willing to die to stop him. It didn't change the course of the war. The Allies weren't going to negotiate with the conspirators, even if the coup had succeeded. They had already committed to unconditional surrender. Germany would be defeated completely, no matter who was in charge. But it did change how some people thought about Germany after the war. The fact that Germans like Stauffenberg had resisted, even when it was almost impossible, meant that not everyone in the country was guilty. There was hope that Germany could be rebuilt into something better. What if the bomb had worked? Historians love to ask, what if Stauffenberg's bomb had killed Hitler? Would the war have ended sooner? Would millions of lives have been saved? The answer is complicated. If Hitler had died on July 20th, 1944, the Nazi leadership would have been thrown into chaos. Himmler, Göring, and Goebbels would have fought each other for control. The Wehrmacht might have fractured between officers loyal to the conspirators and those still committed to the Nazi cause. But would Germany have surrendered? Probably not right away. The conspirators planned to seek peace with the Western Allies while continuing to fight the Soviets. They hoped Britain and America would agree to a negotiated peace that would leave Germany intact as a buffer against communism. But the Allies had already made it clear they would accept nothing less than total surrender. Churchill and Roosevelt weren't interested in negotiating with any German government, even one led by anti-Nazi officers. So, even if the coup had succeeded, Germany probably would have kept fighting. Maybe not for as long, but long enough for tens of thousands more people to die. Still, if Hitler had died in July 1944, some things would have been different. The final months of the war were some of the bloodiest, with Hitler refusing to surrender even as Allied armies closed in from both sides. A new German government might have ended the war a few months earlier, saving countless lives on all sides. The Holocaust might have been slowed or stopped. By July 1944, most of Europe's Jews had already been murdered, but hundreds of thousands were still alive in camps and ghettos. A new government might have halted the killing, though it's hard to say for sure. What's certain is that Stauffenberg believed his action could make a difference. He knew the odds were against him. He knew he would probably die, but he tried anyway because he believed it was the right thing to do. The legacy of a failed hero. Today, Claus von Stauffenberg is remembered as a hero in Germany. There are memorials to him and the other conspirators in Berlin. Streets and buildings are named after them. Every year on July 20th, German leaders lay wreaths and give speeches honoring their memory. But his legacy is complicated. Some people see him as a true hero who stood up to evil when almost no one else would. He risked everything, knowing he would probably fail, because he believed it was his duty. Others point out that Stauffenberg was no saint. He served the Nazi regime for years. He fought in Poland, France, and the Soviet Union, helping Hitler conquer Europe. He didn't turn against the regime until Germany was losing the war. Was he really motivated by conscience, or did he just want to save Germany from total defeat? The truth is probably somewhere in between. Stauffenberg was a complicated man living in a complicated time. He made mistakes, He served a regime he should have opposed sooner, but when it mattered most, when he had the chance to act, he didn't hesitate. He walked into Hitler's headquarters with a bomb, knowing that if it worked, he would be saving millions of lives, and knowing that if it failed, he would die in the most horrible way imaginable. He did it anyway. That takes a kind of courage most people will never have to show. The lesson we can't forget. The story of Claus von Stauffenberg and the July 20th plot isn't just a piece of history. It's a reminder of something we need to remember today. Evil doesn't just come from monsters. It comes from ordinary people who go along with it because it's easier than resisting. It comes from good people who convince themselves that staying silent is the smart choice. And resistance doesn't come from perfect heroes. It comes from flawed human beings who decide they've had enough, who look around at the world they're living in and say, "This is wrong, and I'm going to do something about it, even if it costs me everything." Stauffenberg wore the uniform of the German army. He swore an oath to Hitler. He fought for the Third Reich. But when he realized what that regime really was, he chose to betray it. He chose to become a traitor to the state so he could be loyal to his conscience. And that's why his story matters, not because he succeeded, but because he tried. The bomb didn't kill Hitler. The coup failed. Germany still fought for another 9 months before finally surrendering in May 1945. Millions more people died in that time. But Stauffenberg's attempt proved that even in the darkest moments, even when evil seems unstoppable, there are people who will stand up and fight back. And sometimes that's enough. Not to change the outcome, but to remind us that we always have a choice. If you found this story as powerful as I did, hit that subscribe button for more untold stories from history.